Bene. Intanto vi saluto in italiano, visto che siamo qui in Italia, siamo tutti italiani presenti, e ringrazio il dottor Piccolo per questa opportunità che credo sia davvero un'occasione, diciamo, di confronto molto importante. Allora, io, come vedete dal titolo, parlerò in generale di quello che io ritengo siano i tratti fondamentali dell'economia e soprattutto delle sue trasformazioni nel corso del tempo, nell'area mesopotamica in generale, ma soprattutto il sud mesopotamico, perché qui non posso parlare di tutto e quindi mi concentro sull'area in cui questi fenomeni di cui parlerò sono nati. Quindi adesso proseguo in inglese secondo le indicazioni che sono state date. So, the crucial transformation, which I will try to exemplify with the case of Mesopotamia in pre-state and early state societies, that means a period running from 6th millennium to 3rd millennium, to beginning of first half of 3rd millennium BC, is the transition from an economy basically aimed at ensuring the subsistence, food security, and prosperity of communities to an economy whose goals partially diverged from its originally primary function, pursuing the continuous growth and accumulation of goods and resources, mainly for the benefit of some social categories. The first type of economic efforts were oriented to maintain the balance of the system by optimizing the adaptation of the communities and their needs to the basic resources offered by the environment. The second type of economic drives tended to expand production and broaden the sphere of action of those who were running it by continuously pushing to more resource exploitation and transforming the surplus from being a food reserve for shortage and guarantee of subsistence reproduction into a sort of capital, of course, into comma, to be incremented and reinvested in labor and new products in a self-powering circuit of continuous growth, in other words, into a kind of profit-making tool. The transformation process was, however, very long, and with varying outcomes according to many factors, among which the original social structures of communities, I mean communal or family-based, egalitarian or hierarchical, and the forms of subsistence organization they put in place to cope with the environmental stresses and potentials, as well as with the related social needs. There were different steps in this long process, which also involved a gradual transformation of the economic strategies and goals of the leaders from being mainly focused on staple production and their secondary products to broadening their interest to new production domains and to satisfy widened economic and social demands. The management and interference on staple products, and even more on the means to produce them, that means land, livestock, and labor, were anyhow a powerful means of control over people's life, and hence a source of political power, and thus remained for a long time the main focus of the economic policies of early rulers, even when hierarchically and early state societies were formed. Only later, the economic interest of central institutions and high-status social figures who embodied them progressively expanded into other spheres of productions, aiming at obtaining more durable and long-term storable goods that could be accumulated and somehow capitalized. Food production and its byproducts, however, continue to be the core of centralized economy, at least in Mesopotamia, even in the fully state societies at the end of the 4th and early 3rd millennium. To illustrate the process giving rise to such crucial transformations, before dealing in more detail with the 4th and 3rd millennium Mesopotamian societies, I would briefly and very concisely analyze and compare the roots of the phenomena in the two main regions of Mesopotamia, southern and northern. Northern Mesopotamia has a climate with an annual rainfall that in most of the territory allowed dry farming, particularly in the northernmost part of the Jezira steppe plains, and the well-watered Kabul River basin, which offered good agricultural potential. These plains were surrounded by the hilly flanks and mountains of the Taurus and Zagros ranges, which were ideal for caprine grazing, as well as for the procurement of basic raw materials such as timber and stone, missing in Mesopotamian lowlands. The mountain valley also opened the way to metal-rich highlands of Anatolian Caucasus. Thus, diversified adjacent ecological regions offered distinct resources and potentials. Thanks to the rainfall regime that allowed dry farming, the first pottery Neolithic settlements, dated to the 7th and 6th millennia BC, spread over a vast area with sedentary or semi-sedentary communities showing an integrated economic organization conducted by different groups that were semi-specialized in the exploitation of various resources in diverse environments, either by moving seasonally or exchanging their products from one village to the other. So dry agriculture was successfully conducted on steppe plains, perhaps also supplemented by limited irrigation along river banks, especially the Khabur and Balik, because Euphrates and Tigris in this area are not very suitable for very easy to be, so the water to be captured. On the other hand, specialized hunting of gazelle and wild ass was carried out in a few ecological niches along the southern edges of the plains. And transhumant pastoralism was practiced in foothills and intermountain valleys. The circulation of products, these are some painting in the pottery of the Halaf period, where in some way this kind of organization is suggested. So hunting is represented, but also dancing, so community practices. So the circulation of products was apparently conducted at a community level. No central or hierarchical structure is visible in these communities, and food produced by the different groups in various seasons seems to have circulated horizontally by means of exchanges between and within communities, sometimes being also stored collectively and equally redistributed among the members of the communities. This hypothetical organization is suggested by substantial archaeological evidence. The villages were small and had an egalitarian arrangement with dwellings similar to one another. They shared outdoor spaces where domestic equipment was scattered without any clear association to individual houses. No building stood out from others, suggesting privileged status. In the Neolithic villages of Upper Mesopotamia, no clear evidence existed for a substantial family-based domestic storage. In at least three different sites, so Sabia Biadi, Arintepe, and Undabagia, large storehouses were found where food and byproducts were stored collectively. Cereals were found in the Sabia Biad storehouse in the river Balik Valley, while large amounts of wild ass bones, about 70% out of 90% of total wild animals, probably were the remains of onagers' skins or dry meat kept in the communal storehouse of Undabagia in the southern semi-arid fringes of the plain. The vegetal remains in this site were few, but the presence among them of Triticum spelta, lentils, and peas, all species difficult to cultivate in that arid environment, suggests they were imported from other villages. Even the large amounts of hunting products stored at Umdagagia indicate that they were not intended for the few inhabitants of this very small site, but were probably destined to food exchange between communities. The extraordinary assemblage of hundreds of clay ceilings bearing the impressions of over 65 different seals, whose images formed the iconographic groups, were found in the large communal storehouse at Sabiabiad, suggesting the possible practice of a collective storage of cereals by families or kin groups, then redistributed by a possible warehouse keeper on behalf of the community. These are the iconographic groups. So several seals that are distinguishable from each other by details, but they belong to iconographic assemblages. So this is important in my opinion because this means families or kin groups or not individuals. So the need to entrust someone with the custody of harvest in an egalitarian community probably arose when some members, perhaps shepherds, left seasonally the village and then claimed their goods upon return, because this is not usual. So there are many other Neolithic communities in the Near East, in Anatolia, for example, where there is domestic storage because they are completely sedentary communities. And the use of ceilings in this very early Neolithic context documents the invention of a kind of administrative system to keep track of stored goods and guarantee their equitable distribution in an egalitarian and cooperative society. The procurement of necessary raw materials, such as flint and obsidian, appear to have been similarly conducted in an egalitarian form, probably circulating down the line from one village to the other. This kind of subsistence economy lasted for more than 2 millennia in the Hassuna and Alaf cultures, being very effective, as highlighted by a remarkable demographic population growth evidenced in the Alaf period, by a constantly increasing number of small villages spread over an ever vast territory. Completely different is the situation in southern Mesopotamia. Southern Mesopotamia was, on the contrary, a fragile and challenging environment. As everybody knows, it is made by the alluvial plain of Tigris and the Euphrates River that flow southwards into the Persian Gulf and has a semi-arid to arid climate, with a low annual rainfall that prevents dry farming in most of the territory. There was conversely an excess of water that had to be regulated in wetlands and marshes characterizing the southernmost delta region along the Persian Gulf. So the alluvial plain is, on the other hand, bordered by the Zagros Mountains to the east and the desert to the west. So the whole area forms a composite macrozone made by different ecological niches very close to each other, whose combined exploitation was crucial for the subsistence economy of the early settled population. For all these and other reasons, the first sedentary communities in the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia settled later than in northern Mesopotamia, around the beginning of the 6th millennium or very end of 7th. So the absence of earlier evidence is probably partly due to the deep alluvial deposits, conditions of severe aridity, unstable water courses near estuaries, swamps, and marshes, and frequent flooding made human settlement difficult without an adequate water control technology. These diversified and challenging conditions, however, by using adequate technical devices and with an appropriate organization, could have offered several and varied resources in a limited area. Extensive cereal farming on the alluvial plains, horticulture and cultivation of date palms close to watercourses and marshes, and fishing along the coast, localized cattle and pig breeding in the plain, and caprines rearing both in some pasture lands in the plain and in the nearby foothills and mountains. Flax cultivation was also possible with irrigation. The multiplicity of resources in a fairly limited area with difficult climatic conditions and unstable water supply led to variable soil fertility and productivity and different land qualities. This may have fostered a competition for the access to best resources, while at the same time requiring some forms of central coordination and governance, as Robert Adams had brilliantly pointed out. Both trends, competition and central coordination, may have favored the formation from the beginning of an unequal, potentially hierarchical social structure based on extended families and possible hierarchical kinship descent rules, such as, for example, we don't know, but it's just an hypothesis, the firstborn rights. This was probably the basis for the legitimization of the social and political roles of early leaders. The centralization of power, thus, was probably both a response to the competitiveness inherent in that social structure and environment, and an adaptation to regional conditions. In the early villages of central southern Mesopotamia, such an hypothesized hierarchical structure is archaeologically well evidenced from the earliest occupation of the plains in the Samarra and Ubaid phases. Large tripartite houses were probably residences of extended families, and in the two extensively excavated villages of Tel Essaouan and Tel Abada, here, one or two of these houses, somebody speaking, stood out for their larger size and distinctive features, suggesting a special status and role of one or two families. Storage seems to be either inside the houses, as in the same village as also in Tel Essaouan, or in distinct storehouses that, however, are not large enough to be considered intended for the entire community. If you look at the scale, this is not so very large as the northern ones, and presumably were related to large households. No cretule or seals have been found in these storage buildings, indicating that they were probably used for keeping the household surplus as a food reserve in a highly productive but risky environment. The presence of various types of cereals, Triticum, Monococcum, Dicoccum, and Spelta, and 6-row barley produced with irrigation suggests that Ubaid societies in lower Mesopotamia had a subsistence economy primarily based on cereal agriculture. The dominance of farming that supported the highly sedentary lifestyles is also confirmed by the predominance of cattle and pigs that are non-mobile species among the faunal remains in the alluvium, so specialized pastoralism was also developing in the surrounding areas. Southern Mesopotamia, as is well known, is devoid of most raw materials. People from the alluvium, however, made extensive use of local or nearby resources, as suggested by the common use of clay sickles. Commonly used materials such as wood, stone, and flint were available regionally from the Zagros Mountains to the east and probably brought by Ubaid fishermen who moved seasonally to distant territories along the Persian Gulf coast, likely exchanging products and raw materials with local populations. Additionally, Some obsidian, not in large quantities, was obtained from distant Anatolia, probably with a traditional down-the-line pattern. But long-distance trade did not yet constitute a regular activity for resource procurement. The production of staple goods was likely managed by the large households, and the presence of tokens, what you see on the right side, so these small geometric clay objects that were used as accounting devices, in the chief house of Tel Abada, suggests a special role played in the management by preeminent families. The absence of cretul and seals in most of Ubaid period settlements, on the other hand, is well in keeping with the prevailingly domestic management of stored goods, which did not require administrative practice. Sealing practices were adopted later, at the very end of the 5th and mostly in the 4th millennium BC, when eminent families probably started extracting labor from less fortunate members of the community and redistributed food to remunerate that labor. The differences in social status that distinguished southern Mesopotamian societies from the northern ones were indeed not yet real economic differences in 5th millennium BC, but they created the potential to become so. High status social members, probably supported by social ideology assigning them a privileged relationship with the divinity, seem to have taken over political and religious leadership, managing ceremonies and rituals in buildings specifically devoted to them, the so-called temples, and public redistribution of foodstuff also took place in this building. The typically Mesopotamian redistributive system in which political religious authorities centralized and distributed food in ceremonial context may have been at the beginning an adaptive response to allow a systematic circulations of various products under the coordination and control of the rulers, but soon became a source of economic power, concentrated in the hands of those preeminent elite households embodying the religious and ruling institutions. Increasing contacts and interactions between northern and southern communities during the 5th and 4th millennia BC gave rise to significant changes in northern Mesopotamian societies. The egalitarian model of the Alaf communities underwent profound structural transformation, manifested in the emergence of more hierarchical relations. So this comparison of the two types of villages in the 6th millennium BC, and then at the end of the 5th, also in the north, we have the same kind of settlement arrangement, completely different. So it's a big structural change of the society. The question of how and why egalitarian societies, which had functioned perfectly well for millennia, with an effective subsistence economy and cooperative community organization, changed so profoundly as to adopt a hierarchical model similar to Southern Mesopotamian one, is still debated. It is possible that one of the factors leading to such a radical change was the overpopulation documented in the northern regions at the end of the Alaf period by the substantial increase in the number of settlements, which may have fostered the need for a more complex organization and a more solid and well-rooted leadership. Thus, we can say the need to govern increasing complexity. On the other hand, hierarchical structural southern groups or households who were probably competing with each other, perhaps also for the religious and political leadership, may have moved northwards from the south in search of new opportunities, exporting a model that became successful. So a new hybrid identity the so-called Northern Ubaid or Northern Uruk cultures, was created. And the new system of more family-based and centralized surplus production and consumption was also established in the North. So the original, less intrinsically hierarchical social and economic structures and the traditional economic habits continue to somehow influence the new societies in the North. The administrative system, first experimented in the Neolithic to manage communal storage and redistribution, became a tool for controlling food circulation by privileged social categories all over Mesopotamia. The so-called Greater Mesopotamia was formed and constituted the basis for the following political and economic developments that led to a structural change toward unequal societies throughout this vast region and triggered the profound transformation of economic goals and strategies, which is the core issue in this lecture. The two key factors for understanding the origin and structural characteristic of this transformation are precisely, on the one hand, the need for community coordination, which may arise for different reasons, environmental, demographic, social, and on the other hand, the drive for internal competition, which is usually linked to family-based economies in challenging environments. The combination of the two factors was the main driving force to change the basic economy's objectives prevailing in egalitarian societies, and the main use of surplus, which shifts its goals from serving the community and family needs, guaranteeing food security and availability, to the accumulation of goods in the hands of elite groups and political leaders. This change consequently also brought about a structural change in the economic habits from a substantial prevailing cooperation to competition. The original roots of this change are found in early southern Mesopotamian societies, where both factors, so coordination and competition, seem to have existed from the beginning of the plain occupation. We shall therefore mainly concentrate on the development process in southern Mesopotamia, where they initially originated. As increasingly more solid and powerful political institutions were formed there, the tendency to accumulate surplus in the hand of leaders and their families, which were somehow considered a kind of state households. So the households that were embodying the state institutions had their property that were perceived ideologically as a state property. So central institutions and their representatives accumulated increasing amounts of surplus or in the form of staple goods, either through offerings or tributes or both. And since staples could not be kept for long, the rulers redistributed them as a kind of real or ideologically perceived service to community members. The rulers progressively appropriated this surplus in an increasingly substantial amount so that it ideologically appeared as state or god property, and its redistribution became ever more a reinvestment in the form of remuneration for labor performances, thus continuously increasing the produce income and the amount of surplus stock in a self-feeding circuit. The expansion of transactions, especially these are some images on the seals from the 4th millennium Mesopotamia. This is mainly from Mesopotamia, from Uruk, that show people working in agriculture, in herding, and so on. So the expansion of this transaction, especially the redistribution, led to the development of an increasingly complex administrative system and gave rise to a new category of people partially or totally dependent on central institutions. I mean officials with various tasks who formed a nascent bureaucracy. All this is archaeologically clearly evidenced by the concentration of thousands of mass-produced bowls that were standard food containers and hundreds of clay ceilings with many different seal impressions in large monumental public or ceremonial areas. This is the Uruk-Ean sacred area that many of you already know. This evidence is also supported by the images depicted on seals, which in the late Uruk period have become cylinder seals, more suitable for representing actual scenes with strong ideological significance. So the ideology of power was indeed a very effective tool for obtaining and maintaining consensus. So here you have two types of images that support the idea on the one hand of the participation of the leader in agricultural activities, and on the other display his strength with respect to the population. At the end of the period, so around 3200 BC, the huge increase in the number and variety of transactions performed led, as many people already know here, to the introduction of writing for keeping not only record, but also memory of them. It appeared first exclusively in the big city of Uruk and consisted of pictographic and numerical signs, and later developed into an actual cuneiform writing spreading to other sites. Deciphering the thousands of Uruk and early dynastic tablets yielded crucial information about the economic system of these early phases of state formation, and interestingly supported what was assumable from the archaeological evidence. We now know that the capacity to extract labor by leaders and high-status persons and families took various forms, from occasional or seasonal corvée to regular labor performances, and encouraged an increasing appropriation by the leaders and the high-status persons of means of production, especially land and livestock. And so this elite could make productive these new means by labor, using labor performances. In this way, a real class of landowners was formed, which coincided with the high-rank households and their officials, excluding from these privileges large sections of the populations who increasingly had to alienate their labor in order to survive. In northern Mesopotamia, the new hierarchical socioeconomic structure resulting from the emulation of the southern model seems to have been less markedly diversified and unequal, perhaps due to both the different opportunities offered by the environment and the persistence of traditional relations in the small towns and villages surrounding the cities. This is just a comparison between the two big cities of the north, Tel Brak, and south, Uruk, where you can see, well, apart from the dimension of Uruk, that is the double of Tel Brak, the different impact on the landscape. So the Uruk presence create around it a kind of empty space that was serving the city. The Tel Brak has instead a series of small sites around the big cities that were interacting with the cities. So the relationship is less dominant and less hierarchical. So the emergence of powerful political institutions that centralized important sectors of the staple economy in the Near East only originated in certain socio-economic and environmental contexts, such as Lower Mesopotamia, spreading only later to other regions of the so-called Greater Mesopotamia, or in different ways and times in areas such as the Nile Valley, that you know better than me. So where there are environmental stress, social stresses, so needs for coordination. Where conversely, the early elites did not have the incentive and opportunity to interfere in the basic economy of the population, real centralized state institutions did not emerge, at least not so early. For example, in West Anatolia, West Central Anatolia, emerging high-rank figures archaeologically evidenced in the 3rd millennium BC appear to have exercised a certain degree of political power, perhaps mainly consisting of population and territorial protection, but they did not significantly interfere in the domestic economy, which remained fundamentally autonomous in a natural environment that was favorable to a family conduction of agriculture and animal husbandry. They might have provided some support in the organization and production of trade routes, particularly metal routes, of which Anatolia is very rich. But their interference might have been marginal in actual basic economic terms. No stores or workshops or people circulation and activities, nor evidences of administered transactions have been found in the elite areas in the Troy cultural citadels, where the distinctive traits, beside the separation in fortified, isolated spaces, only consisted of a concentration of prestige metal objects and a few weapons to be exhibited and flaunted as a mark of prestige and status. These objects, which were also found in elite burials, many other metal objects, and then put out of circulation because they are in the tomb, were not yet part of a large and economically significant production, and the elite economy, if any, did not interact at all with the domestic economy. Control over staple products and the means to produce them, especially labor control, in the Mesopotamian context, conversely, was a powerful tool for dominating people's life, and hence a portentous instrument of both political and economic power, resulting in the formation of state institutions and the development of a specific sector of so-called institutional economy. Domestic economy was strongly conditioned by the loss of opportunities due to the concentration of land and means of production in the hands of state institutions and the centralization of labor, which was extracted from household members. And it was also conditioned by the remuneration forms of that labor, both with wages and allocation of land and livestock, over which central institutions partly maintained certain rights. It was an unbalanced competition, and the only way for this economic system to be accepted was a strong ideological legitimization of leaders' power, which was vested. So this is the Uruk again with the various element. No. Okay. Well, exactly, which was vested with a religious connotation and a special link with the gods, as evidenced by the ceremonial location of most economic transactions in the sacred and temple context in the Mesopotamian world, especially in the earliest phases of this process. Such a powerful religious legitimization of central institutions' activities is also well known from Egypt and other ancient civilizations where a strong centralized power developed. As Polanyi had brilliantly understood, at least in my opinion, the economy was embedded in other institutions, political and religious, and the production and circulation of goods was largely, though not totally, institutionally regulated in those contexts. In 4th millennium BC, Lower Mesopotamia, the centralized surplus, and perhaps the surplus in general, was primarily destined to internal use and circulation within the political landscape where it was produced, and only to a lesser extent it was destined for exchange with other communities. The investment in non-food production by central institutions in the earliest periods of state formation, as evidenced by both archaeological and textual data, and even by iconographic expressions in the images depicted on seals, seems to have mainly or exclusively been focused on craft activities that produced objects widely required in institutional context and used locally available materials, such as wool for weaving and clay for pottery making, both items highly demanded for storage and redistribution. Metals were certainly also demanded at the end of the fourth millennium, but limitedly to prestige objects, and therefore in small quantities. These are from the site where I work, from Aslan-Tepe, that was part of this large world in this period. While there is no actual or symbolic evidence of direct involvement of the central institutions in the procurement of raw materials or in the object manufacture, we do not know how and by whom metal objects were produced. But it is likely that shepherds moving in the mountains where the deposits were located played a role in the procurement of raw material, either in the form of ore or smelted ingots. But the required quantities were limited, and there is as yet no evidence that this was an organized and regular long-distance trade. The political economy of early leaders continued to be basically aimed at controlling staple production and circulation, but being driven to increase more and more their income by continuously reinvesting surplus in labor, it was bound to grow and expand. And in parallel with the development of craft specialization and technology, was pushed to change again, gradually expanding its interest to other types of goods. The increasing specialization and the development of a rich and varied craftsmanship, also favored by urbanization. Urbanization was a key factor in the development of labor specialization and related technology. In the course of the third millennium BC, started producing new tools and durable items, which could be accumulated and stored for a long time. This partially transformed the social use of some commodities and the perception of their value, also influencing the use of surplus and the institutional political economy. A few commodities that were part of the centralized economic system, such as textile and barley, had probably already also acquired a new use as exchange goods at the end of the fourth millennium, barley especially in northern Mesopotamia. But their circulation seems to have been limited to local or regional exchange networks in this early phase. So these are the areas where copper ores are present, so very widespread in the mountains of the Caucasus region, northern Anatolia, Zagros and Iran, Oman, Sinai, and Eastern Egypt, and so on. So there is and these are mainly copper and polymetallic ores. That means copper with arsenic, antimony, and other elements that were useful for alloy, for metal alloy. So one of the commodities that was crucial in the transformation of economic system and goals was metal, which in the third millennium BC was no longer just used for making prestige objects destined to the elite, but was also intended for the production of everyday tools. This is a crucial change in initially limited and then increasingly larger amounts. When metallurgy developed enough to produce metal tools in sufficient quantities to replace flint and obsidian, this commodity acquired a real economic and not only social and political value. This implied the need to ensure the regularity of its supply, and hence the importance of long-distance exchange as a regular economic practice. the possibility of hoarding and capitalizing metal and some other non-locally available goods, obtaining them on a larger scale, seems to have gradually increased the institutional interest in long-distance exchange as well. At the same time, a transformation was also taking place in the economic role of independent production components, so families and individuals, which entailed an enhancement of the economic weight of households and their greater ability to compete with the institutional economy, particularly in the running of the new activities. So reinvestment of food surplus began to be also directed towards external exchange, both by families and by institutions. And although I think that internal use, in my opinion, continued to be important, if not prevailing, for a long time. But even though the development of external exchange, that is trade, was linked to the emergence of new needs, which were in turn linked to the manufacture of new items, these needs continue to be real needs, closely related to everyday life, the satisfaction of social needs, and the production of essential and useful goods. There is no evidence of mechanisms that create artificial needs or keep consumption low in favor of exchange, as those that Sergio Cesarato referred to last time as for mercantilism. So no mechanism of this type. It was the utility of the goods that seems to have continued to determine the economic drives and influence the very conception of wealth. My suggestion is that the value attributed to commodities was still fundamentally tied to their use value and was not a result, except to a very limited extent of exchange regulations. That is to say, there was no market in the proper sense of term in those periods that regulated prices, but the value of goods in exchange transactions must have been principally established on the basis of two factors: their social utility and demand, and the labor and effort spent to produce them. The difficulty of obtaining rare materials from distant regions must have been certainly also part of these efforts, and therefore probably a criterion for the attribution of value was also the distance from which the goods came. But I believe that this only worked in cases where goods were actually in demand by societies, for which a regular and guaranteed supply was therefore required. This was the case with tin, available only in limited areas far to the east, which became indispensable in the manufacture of bronze objects in order to replace copper alloys using the more available but very dangerous arsenic, when production had considerably increased quantitatively. It was precisely the need for tin supplies that led to the formation of some of the main trade routes in the ancient Near East. It was only at this point, when trade and exchange became one of the important economic tools in supply systems, that value measuring devices such as weights and pre-monetary items, so-called, came into being to facilitate the establishment of more or less fixed equivalence ratios. Metal itself, particularly silver, took on this function, either in the form of pieces of metal, ingots, or even more so as objects with a more or less constant size and weight. These are some spiral objects that were found all together in a pot, accumulated probably with this kind of function. These steps, which were the prelude to the later introduction of coins, revealed that a significant change was already taking place in the form and above all in the function of the economy. So just to conclude, the opposition between ancient and modern, pre-monetary and currency-based economies is not a contrast between two systems, but between various systems, regionally defined and often in historical succession, all in transformation, and in some cases in transition from one another, which therefore have blurred and flexible boundaries. And it is not a contraposition between elementary economies aimed at obtaining the essential and well-planned economies aimed at optimizing production and growth. Even the most basic subsistence economies aim at rationalizing resource exploitation and allocation and pursue efficiency. Indeed, the relationship with resources in the egalitarian economies was more balanced and respectful of the natural environment and its potential, and much effort was put into trying to maintain this balance. It is a matter of sustainability and survival. What could also be an important lesson for us today, I think. I believe that the real opposition, which brings into play the very function of the economy, is between economies that aim at a broad and widespread prosperity of the community and economies that aim at self-sustaining and growing for the benefit of a few who hold the keys to decision-making and economic control. Thank you.